Welcome. Starting with our big story this hour. Fear is an important part of Trump's politics, and in the run-up to the 2020 presidential polls, he is making sure that it remains the central plank of his campaign. Only this time, rather than a foreign enemy, he is stoking fear of the fellow American. At a time when America has been hit by twin waves of the coronavirus and the Black Lives Matter protests, Donald Trump has chosen his side. After terming protesters as a disgrace to the country, Trump has gone on to defend the 17-year-old charged with double murders in Kenosha, Wisconsin.
We're looking at all of it. That was an interesting situation. You saw the same tape as I saw. And he was trying to get away from them, I guess, it looks like. And he fell. And then they very violently attacked him. And it was something that we're looking at right now, and it's under investigation. But I guess he was in very big trouble. He would have been. He probably would have been killed. But it's under investigation.
Rather than calling for calm at the time of nationwide protests, President Trump has chosen to brand all protesters as vandals, thugs, breaking the law, and he has been backing law enforcement agencies despite the overwhelming evidence of brutal and excessive force being used against members of one community. And for a country which takes pride in being the freedom of speech champion of the world, Trump is clearly not interested in listening to Americans.
Biden is using mafia talking points. The mob will leave you alone if you give them what you want. That's what it is. The mob will leave you alone, give them what you want, but it doesn't work that way, because once you give them, they keep taking. What happens is you give and give and give and you take, and they no longer respect you. And that's what's happened with the Democrats, because I actually think they've lost control of these radical left maniacs. I think they've lost control because I don't think they feel that's helping them.
As he heads out to Kenosha, Wisconsin to take stock of the damage, there's growing fear that his visit will be exactly the opposite of the unifying effect that White House claims as the objective of the trip. Now, Trump is not expected to meet Jacob Blake, paralyzed from the waist down below after being shot by a policeman, nor his family members during the course of his visit to Kenosha. Democratic state and local leaders urged Trump not to come to Kenosha. In a letter to the president, Wisconsin Governor Tony Evers said, and I quote, "I am concerned your presence will only hinder our healing." Now, despite Trump's big claim on his visit to Kenosha, the truth is any inflammatory words will harm him a lot more than Biden. Now, 4 years ago, Trump became the first Republican since 1988 to carry Wisconsin, and the state is one of a handful of battlegrounds that could decide the election this year. A Marquette Law School poll in early August before the conventions gave Biden a 49 to 44% lead over Trump. Kenosha is likely to witness massive anti-Trump protests during his visit. However, going the way the president views these protests, he just might end up touting this bunch of left maniacs, not aggrieved Americans who just want their president to listen to them. For more on this, Nick Harper joins us live from Washington, D.C. Good evening. Thank you for being with us. Now, Trump is due to visit Kenosha, and rather than calling for calm at a time of nationwide protests, he's branding the protesters as vandals and thugs. And some say that he's trying to use racial unrest as a campaign advantage.
That's right, yes. It's become very clear over the last 24 hours that one of the big central issues of this election is going to be all about violence and who is to blame for that violence. Now, Donald Trump says that it's down to the Democrats because he says the violence that we've seen in Kenosha, Wisconsin, most recently at the weekend in Portland, Oregon, is happening in places that are run by Democrats. But the Democrats are saying that Donald Trump is stoking that violence, that he's fanning those flames, and they are very concerned concerned about this trip to Kenosha, Wisconsin. They're asking him to stay away. The White House says that it will be a unifying trip, that he's there to meet law enforcement officers and, he says, to survey the damage from recent rioting. But like you mentioned, we are also expecting anti-Trump protesters to be out on the streets. The idea of calling for calm, something that a president would normally do in a time of violent crisis, has not happened. Donald Trump has made it very clear that he does not want to go down that route. Instead, he's going to Kenosha to meet with law enforcement, to not meet with Jacob Blake or his family or any of the Black Lives Matter protesters, and there is real fear that his trip will only exacerbate the problems that we've seen and continue to widen that divide between Donald Trump and the Democrats and the protesters.
Right, and Nick, as you have mentioned, Democratic state and local leaders urging Trump not to come, and quoting, they have saying that he will only hinder their healing. What is this saying, especially considering we are so close to the elections?
Well, absolutely, yes. About 9 weeks or so to go to the election. Now, up until just a few weeks ago, the thinking was that some of the big issues in this election would be essentially a referendum on how well Donald Trump has handled the COVID-19 pandemic and the subsequent economic fallout, the fact that the economy is faltering, that there are millions of people out of work. There had also been this issue of social reform, the fact that we've seen about 3 months of protests, anti-racist protests following the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis back at the end of May. So social reform and that need for racial justice was certainly an issue, but it's become a much bigger issue within the course of the last week or so, with that violence that we've seen in both Wisconsin and Portland. 2 people dying in Kenosha, 1 person at the weekend dying in Portland. So yes, it's becoming a central theme, and there is a real worry, I guess, from both sides that it is becoming something that will not unify the nation at all, but it will divide it further, and it will also mean a very ugly election campaign between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Joe Biden continuing to say that the Trump administration is dividing the nation, that it's fanning the flame of violence, that it has for the last 3.5 years done nothing to try and tamp it down, but rather has inflamed it throughout. So I think we're seeing, as we head into this final race towards November's election, things turning very toxic, potentially very ugly, and there is worry that we could see more violence on streets in towns and cities across the United States as Donald Trump continues to visit cities and continues to make speeches, as he had over the last 24 hours, about how he views the violence.
Worrying indeed. Thank you very much for that update, Nick.